Hey guys, Pieguyrulz here, and welcome back to Square Theory. So, let's talk story in SpongeBob episodes. How important is it, how it's changed pre-movie, post-movie, that sort of thing. So first of all, how important is the story in a SpongeBob episode? Well, it's not really going to be a surprise if you've been following my videos. I think it's important, but not as important as the comedy. And there's a lot of reasons I think this. And I'm going to kind of go down the list here, and I want you to keep in mind when I'm saying these that they apply to, at least 98% of the SpongeBob episodes. There might be a few episodes that do things that I'm going to say that they don't in this, but just keep in mind I'm speaking generally. This is most of the series this applies to. So let me just quickly... There we go. Alright, so, first of all, the characters are not deep. To tell a good story, you need to have deep characters. You need to have complex characters. You need to have characters that aren't, say, wishy-washy from episode to episode. The characters on SpongeBob are great. They're great because they're simple, really. And that's not to say that they can't get complex at times, but they're never ever gonna get too complex. No character has any sort of, deep, dark backstory, and, if they do, it's like, oh, Patrick got hit with dodgeballs as a kid, and that's not something that's, a part of his story that's just for that one episode. You see what I'm saying? There isn't any sort of real intensity and complexity to the characters, and then there's things like SpongeBob can be completely ignorant in one episode and yet seemingly somewhat intelligent, if not eccentric, in other episodes. To tell good stories, you have to have consistent characters. If you're trying to go for a story, if you're trying to go for comedy, on the other hand, your characters can be a little bit flexible, as long as they fit the joke and as long as they don't feel too out of character. Yeah, the characters aren't very deep. And then likewise, most of the subject matter for stories aren't very deep. We're talking about very, very, very basic things. There's a whole series of episodes about Plankton stealing the Krabby Patty formula. That is a basic story. Character A has something, character B wants something. And they throw little fun twists into the mix, but at the end of the day, the basic story is the same. And I guess those episodes are good examples for what I'm talking about here. Because really, you're not going to get a SpongeBob episode that deals with, I'll just use Adventure Time as an example, having, severe, complex issues of abandonment because of your father. I mean, we get Pearl's daddy issues, but those are very, 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 oh, well, he doesn't spend money on her and is kind of a jerk to her, and she's a little bit upset at this sometimes. That's about as deep as that goes. And then anytime they do handle a subject matter that is somewhat serious, it's totally by accident, completely, and they usually manage to botch it up. And then, like I was saying with the formula thing, the next point here is that the stakes are very low. Think about how many times in the course of the series has SpongeBob's life been in peril. Not that you actually thought he was ever going to die, except for the movie. The movie's different, that's a movie. But in the series, how many times has he even been put in mortal danger? Really, not that much. I'm sure there are some examples, but not very often. And I'm not even talking about, it has to be the sort of thing where it's, a gun. It could be the sort of thing where, there's a monster, or where, there's an episode where he's trapped in Sandy's tree dome without water. Okay, that's mortal danger, technically. Stuff like that. You don't even see it that often. The biggest stakes in a lot of these episodes is, will Plankton get the formula, or will SpongeBob and Patrick remain friends throughout the episode? And you should see the immediate problem with this is the fact that you know what's going to happen at the end. You know that, yes, SpongeBob and Patrick are going to be friends again. And even if they did something controversial and ended the episode where they weren't still friends, it's not going to carry into the next episode. Which is my next point. There's not continuity in this show. There's not strong continuity at the very least. Occasionally they'll remember something and decide to reuse it, but it's not the same as one episode flowing into the next. It's not the same as consequences from one episode carrying into the next. So taken on their own, the stories don't mean much. They're not part of a bigger narrative. They're not part of character development. They're not part of anything but a standalone story. when you have something that's at stake that could possibly change, if there might be a time where maybe Plankton does get the Krabby Patty formula and has it for a little while, and then in a later episode, I don't know, his mind gets erased or something like that, well, that's a legitimate stake. You could legitimately, fear that Mr. Krabs could lose the formula to him. That is a story that isn't entirely predictable. And the consequences of one story would lead into another. But SpongeBob doesn't have that. SpongeBob doesn't do that. And SpongeBob doesn't have much time either, is the thing. For most episodes, it's 11 minutes. Sometimes it's even like 4 minutes. You can't really tell a complex story in that time. And they don't try to. I'm not saying these things to call them out, to say they're bad storytellers. I'm just saying this isn't what the show was ever designed to be. This is not what the show really works for, is more complex episodes, is more serious, character-driven, that kind of stuff. And then lastly, it's not like there's really anything else going on as far as, it's not like there's any super amazing action sequences. Occasionally there'll be one, and occasionally it'll be good, but usually because of the comedy, not because of, brilliant animation or choreography or anything like that. So those are the reasons why I just don't value the story as much as I value the comedy. I mean, really, if you strip a lot of these episodes of comedy, if you take away the jokes and just look at the story, not only are they basic, but they're stuff that we've heard a million times over. No Weenies Allowed, one of my favorite episodes, it's just about SpongeBob trying to get into a tough guy bar using wacky schemes. I mean, that's a cartoon trope, if not just a general comedy trope that's been around for decades upon decades. How simple of a plot is that? Very. And then you also have issues like, if you strip an episode of jokes, and Enemy-in-Law is a great example of this, if there's not enough jokes, you're left kind of wondering, am I supposed to be taking this seriously? And if I am, it's just a kind of weird love story between Plankton and Mr. Krabs' mom. It's like, if you strip the comedy, you're just kind of left, should I take this seriously? And if I do, how is it not insanely cliche and just not very interesting of a story? So yeah. And I think the thing is, pre-movie to post-movie. Pre-movie, I would say upwards of 90% of the episodes are very, very basic plots. And in most cases, whenever they aren't, they do something high concept. Krusty-Krab training video, SB129, The Smoking Peanut even, Mermaid and Barnacle Boy 5. These are episodes that focus on things like the superhero aspect, or what if SpongeBob was in a training video? I mean, that doesn't even have a story, the Krusty-Krab training video. It's just, what if he was in a training video? The only narrative in that is that SpongeBob wants to learn how to make the Krabby Patty, and the narrator won't let him. Stuff like SB129, which is a lot more about atmosphere. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that even though they might change up the formula, and even though there are episodes in the earlier seasons that are a little bit more story-driven, they still don't forget about the comedy, and in fact, they use it to their advantage. They use the more serious story to punch you with a joke when you're not expecting it. Squidward getting down on the ground and doing sit-ups while yelling future, you don't expect it because you're too much entranced with the visuals and with where is this story going and all of that other fun stuff. And I think that's the thing. Post-movie, when you look at post-movie, I would say it's about maybe 50% basic, 50% more complex episodes. And there are basic episodes in post-movie that totally work. Mermaid and Barnacle Boy 6. SpongeBob and Friends make a movie. That's it. They explore all options of that. They use that setup for their full potential. But it's a basic plot, and it's very much in the spirit of how a lot of the original episodes were. But it doesn't always work either. You have something like Wigstruck post-movie, where it feels like it's trying to be a basic plot, but at the same time, it also gets a little bit overly complex with oh, well, now we gotta focus on what the stupid band members are doing. Who cares what the band members are doing? And I mean, that episode also fails in comedy and other things. There's other reasons, but I'm just saying, it doesn't always work post-movie. I mean, it didn't always work pre-movie either. But then the other half are these more complex episodes, and I think the thing is, when you go for the more character-driven, the more story-driven episodes, you have a higher rate of failure when it comes to SpongeBob, because the show really wasn't designed for it. It can work. Episodes like the original Fry Cook, very character-driven, very story-driven, it works. I mean, it wouldn't necessarily end up in one of my, top 5 episodes of SpongeBob, but it works. And I mean, here's the thing. It works because it's SpongeBob. It works because they still don't forget about the jokes. It works because we don't see this too often on SpongeBob. If you were to just take this basic bare bones story and transpose it, if you were just write it down as a story and show it to someone, it's not like it's anything groundbreaking or hasn't been done anywhere else or anything like that. But it works because we haven't seen it in SpongeBob and because it still has that SpongeBob charm to it. So that's kind of basically what I think. That pre-movie, they wrote jokes. They wrote a premise. They came up very quickly, I'm sure, with just whatever premise they felt they could get the most jokes out of, and ran with that, and then told all the jokes, explored it to its full potential. Post-movie, I think there's a lot more pressure to tell bigger and better stories because, well, if you're going to do a Plankton stealing the formula story, you have to put a big twist on it because we've seen it so many times before. If you're going to, you have to try not to, show SpongeBob cooking patties on the grill in the same exact way. You have to try to mix it up a little bit. You have to mix up the boating school episodes. You have to mix it up. So I feel like they're spending more time on the story because they have to. They're trying not to repeat themselves, and that doesn't always work, but at least I believe they're trying. And unfortunately, when they put that much effort into trying to make a bigger, better story for SpongeBob, they seem to forget about the jokes. The jokes usually seem to be an afterthought in a lot of these more serious episodes, and that's why they end up with a meh, in my personal opinion. Because they're decent stories, it's not like they're horrific, but if you take out, if you wrote them down just as stories, nothing fantastic. It needs the comedy element to really kind of to pull it in and become fantastic. So that's kind of what I think happened, and I think it does lead to some better episodes. That we have had some good episodes, and coming up in season 6 even, there are some good episodes that are good mostly because of the story and because of the character interactions we haven't seen, and not necessarily because of the comedy. But of course, having a little bit of comedy definitely helps because it just should have comedy. And that's one of the things that gets me, too, is that no matter how serious a SpongeBob story gets, there's no reason for it to not have comedy. We're not talking about something, so serious or so dramatic or anything like that they just couldn't put comedy because it would ruin the tone. There's always room for jokes in these episodes. It's just a matter of, well, I guess, maybe Nickelodeon didn't give them enough time to write jokes. Maybe they didn't quite realize that, hey, when we're counting up the amount of jokes in this episode, it's like 3. So that's kind of my theory on that. And then lastly, I want to touch on the specials. The specials are really, they make me like give up hope that the writers can write like a longer story because they fail so often with this. Atlantis Squarepants. It's the same story being told 5 times. Character wants something, goes to Atlantis, finds a room full of it, sings about it. That is the character arc for Plankton, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, Squidward, SpongeBob, and Patrick. Those are a twofer. That's it. That's the entirety of Atlantis Squarepants. There's a little bit at the end, but not much. That's it. And that's where that fails because they didn't tell a bigger story. They wasted 4 times the amount of time, but they didn't tell a bigger story. If that story was told once with one of the characters, then it wouldn't be repetitive. It might have other issues, but if it was 11 minutes and told once, definitely at least a meh, unless they did something else horrendous. Something like Pest of the West. Pest of the West is bad because it's just every single Western cliche piled on top of each other without trying to write any sort of original or interesting story. Something like, let's see, Whatever Happened to SpongeBob. Okay, that one has too much story. It doesn't actually end up focusing on anything because it's like, alright, bam, SpongeBob's friends hate him. Bam, he leaves town. Bam, he gets amnesia. Bam, he's trying to get a job in the new town. Bam, he defeats the Bubble Poppin' Boys. Bam, he becomes the mayor. Bam, he doesn't want to leave. Bam, his friends kidnap him. Bam, bam, bam. We don't get any time on any of this. We don't get to let any of this sink in. A good story needs a little bit of downtime, and a great option for that is to actually add in some comedy, which was sorely needed in that special. And there's other failures too, even pre-movie. I don't think they really knew what they were doing. When it came to stuff like The Sponge Who Could Fly, they were trying to tell a bigger story, but they just couldn't quite manage exactly how to do it, and still include a lot of comedy. Ugh was an attempt to do something experimental and different, not unlike SB129, but in my opinion, I don't think they pulled it off correctly. And of course, there are good examples. Dungeons and Dragons works because, on one level, it is a basic story. Bumbling village idiot has to go defeat the evil wizard. That's a basic story. But at the same time, you have the complexity of the fact that, yes, we're dealing with, SpongeBob traveling in time to the past, and we're dealing with all the motifs that come along with that sort of thing. It's different from any other episode. And then something like, I'm going to mention it, Have You Seen the Snail? Listen, that episode gets a lot of things right. I am totally willing to give that episode credit where credit is due. It tells a better SpongeBob story than a lot of other SpongeBob stories, but I still don't think it gets it 100% right. First of all, I don't think it had enough comedy, and I think it went overly sappy in some areas that weren't necessary, and the plot is also still kind of overly simplified, even though it didn't have to be. Could have spent less time with SpongeBob on the paddleball and just kind of gotten into the story a little bit more with that. But that's the thing. I think a lot of people like it because it does tell a more complex story. It's trying to, it is ahead of a lot of other SpongeBob stories, especially up to that point. Just in terms of basic plot, in terms of doing something different and interesting, and having a legitimate stakes of, losing your pet, which is a very real stake. It's a very real thing, and it does those things right, and I think that's why a lot of people love it. So yeah, that's my feeling on story in SpongeBob. I think it definitely means something, and I think if an episode isn't funny but still has a strong story, it'll get a meh. If it has a really strong story, if there's an episode out there that has a fantastic story that is just start to finish just great for one reason or another, and even if it is just like doesn't have much comedy at all, I'll give it a good. It's not like a hard and fast rule, but SpongeBob doesn't do that. SpongeBob doesn't tell amazing stories that blow you out of the water most of the time, right? So that's kind of where I stand on all of this. Pieguyrulz out. Oh, one more thing. This video was actually recommended on my Patreon and supported by Roberto S, so give him a thanks and all that sort of stuff. Pieguyrulz